I've sort of changed the order a tiny bit of how I'm running the session tonight. I want to focus on research grants first, and then talk about how we prepare budgets for that. I decided to do it this way because there's no point most of the time writing a budget unless we're actually got a very good grant application in. And I think the grants are the key thing for here. Tonight's objectives are to understand core elements of how we craft a compelling research grant application. And the irony that I scheduled it for this week, as I'm also about to submit a decent sized grant application for next year, it's reminding me how stressful research grants and budgets can actually be. So even when you've done, a few under your belt, they still require quite a bit of energy. I want to understand the typical failings in applications. So the reason why research grant applications fail, so that we can address these in our own applications before we submit them. And maybe tonight I'm also subtly reminding myself what not to do in my own application. I also want to understand how to prepare a value for money budget that achieves the goals you set. And budgeting is not only about allocating how we are going to spend money as part of our funding or as part of our research journey, but it's also making sure that we're spending the money the right way and that we're not wasting money or wasting resources. And that's something that those who will allocate funds for us are certainly wanting to make sure we're not overspending, or in some cases, we're not underspending as well. And the final part I want to do is understand how we budget for self-funded research, because as a PhD candidate, for example, we might be focusing on using our own resources to pay for everything. But also, how do we make sure that we're not spending in a way that is unnecessary for our research? And certainly we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of what the higher education ecosystem provides for us. And that can be from our universities or from other stakeholders as well. So I'm going to break tonight into two big sections: applying for research grants, and then the second big section is going to be the budgeting to reinforce this. So let's start off with the big picture, applying for research grants. And I'm going to start with what is a grant, and put simply, it's money for you for your research. So it's not actually money for you, it's money for your research so that you can do it. And we get grants from a wide variety of sources. It may be things like research fellowship awards, institutional training grants, career development awards, research project grants, program project and center grants. And these come from universities, from industry, from NGOs, non-government organizations. They come from philanthropic organizations or family businesses that want to do something with the community. And they also come from the government. At the moment, I have a very nice university grant, and it fits into a teaching grant rather than a research grant, but it requires me to do research in order to create what I'm doing and build what I'm doing with the particular grant. The one that I'm writing at the moment is actually a linkage between NGO and government from overseas in order to be able to help academics in the global south. So we get all sorts of different grants that are available out there. And of course, every time we get a different grant, there's a different set of criterion, there's a different set of rules. And from our perspective, there's also different levels of criterion that we need to demonstrate to those who are allocating us money. But before that, how and where do we find grants? And there's a couple of really simple ways. And this depends on whether you are perhaps a PhD candidate wanting something that's just going to prop up what you're doing and make sure that you get enough money so you can go through the dissertation phase. Or maybe you're an early career academic and you're looking to make a longer term career trajectory out of this. But how do we find grants? Sometimes we identify something that we wish to do, so we already know where we are. And what we're looking for is that funding source that's right for our project. So we already know the project. What we've got to do is find somebody who's going to go behind it or back it up and say, yeah, I'll give you some money to do this. But there's a different way that we can also go about it. And this also applies for doctoral candidates, but less so. And that's where different organizations, whether it be universities, industry, government, etc., put out a request for proposal. They say, look, I've got some money. What would you do if I gave you the money? Or better yet, I've got some money for you to do this. Tell me how you're going to do it. And are you going to be the best person or the best team, perhaps, to activate and make that particular one happen? So it is a bit of two ways. Quite often, PhD candidates in particular think about the first one. Look, we've got our topic. We know what we want to do. Now I've got to find if someone will pay for it. Now, that's actually a hard way to go about because we're now sifting through lots and lots of opportunities to see if there is alignment. So that does give us a little bit extra work in that sense, but it also means we can be very true to the type of research that we want to do rather than try to fit into somebody else's immediate goals that dictate for us how we can go about doing things. Now, where do we find out about grants? There are different grant databases available. We can ask at university offices. Our supervisors should be our first port of call. Doesn't mean they actually know much. Let's be honest. They may not be fully aware or they may not be that interested in different types of research grants other than the ones that they usually go for. But we have professional associations, industry associations. You've got to do your networking. And by that, I mean, look, you've got to reach out to different people, different organizations, and start asking the questions. Do you guys have money available? Do you offer research grants? Do you have, anything that could help progress my research financially? So the very early step is always going to be not only identifying what grant you want, but really reaching out and talking to people and getting ideas about what grants are out there. The great thing is, even though across the world they say research money is shrinking, actually there's still a huge amount of opportunity. And in many cases, the opportunity does not come from where we expect it to come. It comes from somewhere different who's got an interest or a sort of a shadow interest in what we're doing, but they wouldn't normally come onto our radar. Once we've looked at what grant we want and we've found two or three or even one that we're interested in, what we have to do is understand our personal eligibility. And this kind of relates to a few different things. Sometimes the grants that are out there might exclude PhD candidates. So if you're trying to get a research grant as a PhD candidate, they might actually say, well, actually, no, you need to be a university staff member. And for some of us, that might be, oh, actually, I teach part-time for the university, so there is a back door to do this. But the key criterion, key eligibility criterion that might influence us are our discipline or scope of disciplines. Sometimes when organizations fund research, they are very pedantic, very structured in it being certain disciplines only. So you've got to look and make sure that you're going to fit into there. Now, this can be a problem if, like me, you're interdisciplinary. It can be a problem for some that sit on the outside and are doing research. For example, people who are doing health economics research are not really inside medical sciences, but the relationship is very close. So it's not only do you fit in, it's can you argue that what your disciplinary perspective brings to the research is going to benefit the organization that is offering money. They will look at career stage. Are you an early career? Are you seasoned? Are you a PhD candidate? Some grants are only for doctoral candidates and early careers in their first 3 years, for example. So it gives us an opportunity to get involved. Some might say, well, we hope for a team of researchers that mixes perhaps PhD, early career, and more seasoned professionals. There may be geographical restrictions. There's been a few fantastic grants this last year that I've looked at, but they want research done in countries that I'm less interested in being involved in doing research. I don't have the experience in them, or they don't fit into my own personal areas or geographies of interest. So make sure on that. The research grant I'm applying for at the moment is fantastic, but it has some quirky limitations. And the research grant is about how to help academics in Southeast Asia develop their skills, but it has to be initiated by a British university. And, there's not a lot of British universities here. And even though there are, it has to be initiated by the university in the UK. So that creates a geographical restriction, but it also creates an opportunity. Who do you reach out to? Who do you say, hey, can we do this together? We've got something. And we've found that fantastic workaround for us. But it does put limits on some of us. We might say, you know what? I don't have a solution for this to make it work. There may be expected collaborations or support. So always check out what they tell you about the research grant and whether they're expecting you to collaborate. For example, it might be, we want an interdisciplinary collaboration. Yes, that's great. Or it might be, we want collaborations between 2 or 3 different geographies. Or it might be, for the PhD candidate, it might be, we expect you to collaborate with your supervisor so that we have got some added assurance of how this is going to progress. And the final one is the eligibility criterion becomes the benefit targets. Do the stakeholders that will gain or benefit from your research fit or align to the stakeholders that the funding organization wants to benefit as well? And this can often be the problem. So this has been an issue for me in some of the ones I've seen this year, is that the targets or the target stakeholders that I have aren't enough aligned with the target stakeholders that the organization offering the funding has. There's a few things to be very cautious of, and I'm just going to call them considerations, but this is something when you're looking at getting money. Money is not free. Nobody's going to give you money for nothing. There's always something about it. So be very careful because this can impact not only how you do the research, but what it's going to mean for your future as well. So first of all, know your funder. Very simple advice. Look, you've got an opportunity for a research grant. Who's giving this to you? And the moment you've got who's giving this to you, then simply find out about them. What's their institutional strategy, their corporate strategy, their mission, their vision, their values? Have a look at their position statements, their policies. Does this line up with you? If somebody's giving you money, but they have a very different purpose or very different vision on the world, that might actually cause you problems later. And that kind of leads me into the being aware of research governance issues. And what I mean by this is, as an academic, as a PhD candidate mostly, we're bound first by our university rules. Then we're bound second by the funders' rules. So we've got to make sure that these two match up in a way that is comfortable. And this is going to come into a few different things. First, ethical issues, approvals and from whom. Firstly, you have to get approval from your own university. That's a natural. But if you're being funded elsewhere, and this is funding your doctorate, they may also require an internal approval for ethics from them, which may be different from what is accepted or allowed for by your university. So if there's going to be a double up, you've got to be confident that the organization offering you funds is not going to be causing problems about the ethics approval for you to go and do research. They might be, oh no, we want it done a certain way and we'll approve it. But if your university says no, then that's going to limit what's going to be the opportunity for you for your PhD. Does the organization have a code of good research practice? Understand what they are like and what they expect in terms of, I want to say due diligence, but in terms of due process, making sure that they are ethical and they conduct legal practice. So, for example, a university, if you're working with children, for example, a university is going to require several safeguards in respect of how you interact and collect data from children. A private organization may say, you know what, not really a big problem, just go ahead and do it. You don't need any of these safeguards. Now, that's already a conflict because they're the ones paying for it. But your university is also the one that is guiding you and is meant to create that scaffold around it. There may be issues with intellectual property rights, and I've seen this before. When a funding organization gives us money and we develop something, maybe through our own research, we come up with a great solution, the intellectual property rights might belong to the funding organization, not to us, not to our university. So there's already a conflict. But at the end of the day, as the researcher, we want to have control over the rights that we have, over what we have created, over the solutions that we have perhaps created. And that leads to another problem about publishing rights and expectations. Because from a university, we can publish. A private organization funding our research may actually say, we must approve your publications, which means we may not get any publications because maybe the data did not go the right way. They don't want that data out there. They certainly don't want an analysis of that data because that may reflect badly on something else that they have an interest in. So be very careful that the organizations that are offering you funding do not say, hey, we want to control your publications, because that can be very bad for us. But it can also, flip side, publishing expectations. Excuse me for a sec. What I mean by the publishing expectations is they might want you to churn out certain types of publications as a result of the research. They may want you to do that before it's finished, after. That may interfere with your dissertation because now part of your dissertation becomes self-citation rather than original work. So there are going to be issues that you have to work through and make sure that you can cope with the requirements and the rules that they put in place. We have to consider data protection and privacy. Who is able to access? So I know of cases where private organizations have offered research funding to PhD candidates, but they've also said that the university is not allowed to have access to the data. That's a bit of a problem because, again, that's a conflict. So you've got to find ways to validate, or sorry, to balance that more than anything. And the final one that we don't often think of, because the university covers us in terms of insurance anyway. A private organization may expect us to have indemnity cover or insurance over the work that we're doing and over the practices, because it's a long-term or medium or long-term investment for them as well, which means, okay, easy to do, but coming to our budgets, now we have to spend more money. And that money may seem disproportionate for what we're trying to achieve. So for example, if I'm doing some research with kindergarten children, I'm by default pretty much covered from my university side. I've got my ethics approval. I can go through all of that. The organization says, no problem, ethics is fine. We do it the way you've got it. But then they may say, because you're working with children, we want a different type of insurance to protect against any accusations of impropriety or misbehavior by the researcher that could result in them being sued. So that means we have to spend money. We have to spend more money on insurance that we normally would probably not consider about. Now, there are a few basic resources to help us: supervisor and mentors, peers, other friends, colleagues, classmates, cohorts that have been given grants as well. The university will have a research office that you can go to and talk to with the issues, including your university lawyers, who will be able to advise whether this is going to cause a conflict with university expectations. We do have organizations, professional, scientific, industry, or industrial societies and organizations that can help. They can help us find, they can also help us work through the issues and challenges that we have. And the most important one is grant writing workshops. And it's not like what I'm doing tonight. Tonight's an overview. Most organizations who are comfortable offering money up to others will organize a very specific sharing session that will help you identify what you need. So in the case of the grant that I'm working on at the moment with a couple of colleagues internationally, the grant awarding organization did a face-to-face session in the United Kingdom where they addressed a lot of issues. So my collaborator physically went to the session to understand what are the unique things that they are looking for. And that gave us a lot of feedback. So we now have a very large email about all the different things that they are expected, but advice to help us through that. There are going to be criterion, and I wanted to start off with very broad, okay? Because we're asking somebody else to give us money. What are they looking for? This is most important. We know what we want from our research, but this one should be more about what does the organization that's giving money look for? And there's 2 points here. One, it varies. Every organization that offers money has different criterion and different expectations. What I'm doing here is giving a generic, typical, common ones, but always go through and check with the organization what specifically are their criterion. Because sometimes if you can't meet all the criterion, maybe it's not worth the effort to apply, because even though you've got like 70%, there's going to be more people out there applying who have 95%. So you're not going to get it anyway. So, these are the typical ones, but do check with the organizations too. The typical ones are significance. How significant and ultimately impactful is the research that you're doing? Is it really important? Are you doing research for research's sake? Or are you doing research that is going to fundamentally add value to how different communities interact or are able to embrace something? The second criterion is you, the investigators. As the researcher, do you have the skills to 100% succeed at this? So that came to an interesting discussion for me for a few weeks ago, because the project that we're applying for, and I think looking at what we're doing, we've got a decent chance, but I was asked to find who else I could recommend as collaborators. And I put through a couple of suggestions, both people that I know very well. And my collaborator from overseas came back on one, said, I don't think she's got quite the experience that's necessary. And that was the initial reaction. So I had to spend some time saying, this is why I recommended this person. Yes, I know not 100% of the experience necessary, but is working on this. But there was also a cultural reason as to why I put through. That did not come across very well in a CV, because we don't expect that. So I was able to say, actually, their early career, they've got several publications that are not on their LinkedIn, and I could list that. And I was also able to say, actually, the cultural relevance is because of our target audience and this person's ethnicity and cultural experience makes this person stronger for the case. And it's not only was the person right, it's also how, as we write our application, how, as we write our grant application, do we make sure that that is communicated in a way so the people looking at offering us money can say, yeah, I see why this is the right person. This is somebody who should be part of that team. Now, sometimes, especially when we're a PhD candidate, we might not have a team. It's us. So we've got to make sure that we position ourselves in a way that is going to be understood, that we are competent and capable of completing the research and achieving the objectives so that the research will happen and the people offering the money also get their value. We want to look at innovation. You know, are you doing things differently? Is this different approach going to give us stronger results? That's the key thing. The approach in itself, how we are going to be doing this, again, you know, is it sufficient? Is the sample size or the sample that we want to use going to be enough to make broader, realistic conclusions? And some organizations use the environment as a criterion. And this one is a bit harder because it's not something I really consider a lot, and I never really have considered a lot. But there are impacts on environment, and we've got to be able to showcase that what we're doing is minimizing that. In addition to that, what do reviewers look for? Original thinking, timeliness, articulation of the written application, the attention to detail that you showcase. You know, do not have spelling mistakes in your application. They want to see an ambitious proposal, but not something that's so difficult that it becomes unrealistic. They want to see a clear training plan for the candidate if needed. So, for example, maybe you have to develop certain skills in order to be, or in order to address every way, every method that you want to engage. Have a training plan in there that says, look, I know I'm missing quantitative analysis skills. I'm going to do a 6-week program right now that addresses those skills to bring it up to speed, or I'm going to learn a particular software through this organization. And you can budget for that, but have that training plan for yourself, because just because you don't meet every criterion about being absolutely perfect for this, it does not mean that you cannot attempt to upskill yourself. So you need to include that into it. Clear vision of career progression. So how this is going to contribute rather than a means to an end. And what I mean by here is a lot of PhD candidates go for money because they just need to finish their PhD. Showcase that through this research, you're leveraging to something further, because unless you show that promise for the future, unless you show that long-term strategy, some organizations offering funding may look and say, well, why am I investing in this person now when they're going to stop at the end of this project? They might look at your track record or your potential. So what other successful projects have you done, whether it's been funded or not, but what other successful projects have you done? They look for a convincing research design, evidence of meaningful engagement with stakeholders, so that not only can you do the research, but you're able to engage with the parties involved to extend the value of the research, that you're able to give back. And that becomes the final one, the appropriate dissemination plan. Getting the research is one thing. How are you going to communicate the research to the various stakeholders out there, and in what format? So that's not only evidence. The evidence says you've done it before. The dissemination plan says, this time around, this is how I'm going to make sure that the different stakeholders in my research network, in the research ecosystem I'm involved in, are going to learn about my research and be able to put it into practice for what they're doing. Now, those are the things, those are the criterion that we look for. And we're going to see some repeats in a moment. But this is how do I craft a compelling proposal. This is kind of like writing a research proposal. But writing a research proposal for your doctorate is about convincing yourself and convincing your supervisor that you can do the research. Same thing here, but now you're convincing somebody to give you money to make it happen as well. So when we look at, a strong proposal, we want strong research objectives and questions. Often we have to really think very hard about that, because what we have, for example, in our doctoral research proposal might need some re-emphasis. It may need some tweaking or some realignment. We want to see methodology and feasibility of the project. Now, here's a big difference. In a PhD, it's generally feasible that will happen. But there's also a likelihood, there's a possibility, sorry, not likelihood, a possibility that things won't happen quite the way that they're expected, i.e. the feasibility is different. We'll get some data, we won't be happy with the results, but you can still graduate with your PhD. When someone's funding you, they want to see a successful outcome. They need to know that it's going to generate data analysis, in particular, outcomes that are of value to them. So they're going to look for that success outcome rather than just completion. They want to look at the potential impact. So you have to showcase potential impact and the relevance to or alignment with the funder's goals. This is not what I want from my research. That's one side. But I've got to showcase that the organization that's offering me money, I am aligning with their goals. If my research is going to disprove something that they have done for a very long time, we don't have alignment. We have a conflict of interest. So we've got to be very cautious on that. If their goals are to help a certain segment of society, we've got to make sure that our research is also going to help that particular segment. It may help other segments as well. Fantastic. But we've got to make sure it addresses their segments of interest. And now we have to think about the issues that I talked about previously, the intellectual property, the publishing rights, because that's going to be something that, has an influence for us here. We also want to look at significance versus impact. Significance is about this is worthwhile research, which means something. Impact means the application of the research is going to transform the way in which something is done. And ultimately, whilst as researchers, we look at both, we look at significance, we look at impact. What we really need to showcase is our research will make a change. So we're looking at impact. We want clear and concise writing. That's something that you do. I've got a document that I'm working on. That's one of those track changes documents in Microsoft Word, which I hate. But we are fighting over one or two words, and we keep changing and updating. And you can see the history of how one sentence, although the meaning of the sentence is the same, how over the space of 2 months, the actual construction of that sentence has changed significantly, because we're debating the words, we're strengthening, we've chosen to change our core terminology because we've felt the intonation of one of the terminologies didn't align well or didn't read well. And you can see this. And that's what clear and concise writing is. The writing of the grant application is not an easy thing. It's going to take a lot of time because you have to put that effort in to having it as clear and as precise as possible. And ultimately what that brings us down to is having a compelling narrative that convinces. We want a story that, as I read through, I get more interested in it. It's like a novel. It builds and builds and builds, and then you have the solution. And that's what we want. We want that narrative that says, look, there's a genuine problem here. Our research is going to make this contribution to resolving or to understanding that problem, and to be able to potentially or hopefully make that impact on society. Okay, there is a formal structure. Now, typically, formal structure of a grant application contains these things, but again, varies according to the awarding organization. Always check what they want. But ultimately, it will be a problem statement, a summary of current developments, a statement of what is new about your project. Okay, what are you bringing to the table? What's different for you? An indication of the extent to which the research builds on previous work by you and others. Now, if it builds on previous work by you, that is your track record. That actually means, oh, this person, if this research is ideal, this person is ideal. If it's by others, you're taking advantage of what other people have got in there. And in certain cases, and this is, say, the case today with artificial intelligence in education or artificial intelligence in anything, we know that there is work in the field, but we don't have an exhaustive literature review because it's still being written. Everything's changing on a daily basis. So it's understanding what's happening, but also recognizing that not everything that's happening has been published. Now, a few of the sections, I'm just going to go through a few of the sections on what needs to be put into that application so that you can demonstrate the quality of your work. Now, this is very similar to a research proposal in many ways. The same principles apply, but make sure this goes into your application. So in terms of methods, what do I want addressed? What methods will be applied to achieve the aims? Are the chosen methods sufficiently rigorous to produce clear answers? A research grant, unless they're looking at extremely innovative practices, say, for example, AI, is going to want more than a pilot study. A research grant is unlikely to work for a pilot study, unless maybe in medicine or somewhere else, but in the social sciences and businesses, it's looking for a more substantive study that they can get actual results from. And what is the realistic time frame? Now, here's the big problem. If I'm giving you money, I'm wanting it within a particular set of timeframes. I'm not wanting delays. In fact, the application I'm doing now requires us to sign an assurance that research will start within a particular time frame and research will be 100% completed, both research and delivery, of product. Research and delivery of product of outcomes will be completed within a time frame without overlap. So our realistic timeframes got to work backwards to make sure that if for any reason we are not, there is delays, that still fits into the anticipated time frame. And finally, any potential conflicts of interest with methods, population, or data. Now, again, this comes down to the difference between what is acceptable and embraced within a university scenario and what an external organization offering us funds might want. So, for example, the methods may be something that the organization is not comfortable with, but an academic says, you know what, this is fantastic. It could be as simple as qualitative versus quantitative. Organizations that want hard data Whereas us academics who are saying, actually, I want the narrative too. The choice of population, the definition of the population. Does the organization offering you funding have a particular definition of a population which we might find obscure, or we might find sits outside of the conventional academic definition of same or similar populations? And it's a conflict of interest with data. For example, does collecting that data and making it, using it, making it available, put aspects of the interests of the funding organizations at risk? Might they prefer that that data does not get out there? So, for example, maybe we're doing government research, government-funded research. The data that we may obtain may not look favorable on the government. And therefore, that might be considered a conflict of interest because they're going to say, you can't publish this. But again, it comes back to, but this is my PhD or this is my research. It's my job to get it out there. They're giving you the money and saying, we don't like the data. You may not publish it. So, you've got to be aware not only how you're going to go about doing everything, but you've got to be very conscious about whether there is going to be that conflict of interest, potential conflict of interest on these issues. There are ethical aspects. Make sure your proposal addresses the relevant ethical considerations. Most often, these are going to be asked directly. So, you're going to be asked to make certain ethics statements, etc. But sometimes you need to fill in the blanks. Sometimes you need to explain the process or give more detail so that they can see the way you think about this. Now it comes to personnel, people. It's not just you. So it is at the start researchers or co-researchers. So if it's more than one person who's the primary researcher, who's the secondary, additional researchers, and so forth, what order of priority or responsibility do they take? If it's just you, sell yourself. You've got to showcase that you have all of the skills, or you can develop all of the skills necessary to make this happen in the appropriate time. There may be staffing requirements, and this one's kind of normal. So, do I need a research assistant? It might just be a part-time person. I may be contracting somebody in to run some data and help me, with the data processing and perhaps with a little bit of the analysis. But what do I need them for? And it's got to make sense. I can't hire a personal assistant because I need somebody to manage my calendar and charge this to my research grant. That's not going to make sense. They're going to say you do it yourself. So you've got to make sure that what you need help for is very detailed and that it makes sense. And in my case, I'm not quantitative, so I'm going to have a research assistant that is going to help me with data processing, analysis, and they're going to be running the numbers. I'm going to be working with all of that, but they're going to be running it for me. So it's got to be sense that it's going to make my ability to complete this project work. You need to provide details of them. Now, whether it's them, whether it's you, you've got to provide the details. And the final one, if you're going to minimize expenses, if you've got, say, a research assistant, what's the phasing out? When do you get rid of them? For example, I'm hiring a research assistant for 3 months to complete task A and task B. Other than that, nothing. So it's about showcasing that, oh, I've got somebody doing this, this, this. At this phase of the project, their involvement decreases significantly. They become very part-time for a month, and then they're gone. So it's a really solid plan about how you're going to use people as well as how you're going to spend money for things. Now we come to budget, and I'll do budget in about 5 minutes in a big scale. But you need a very strong itemized budget for all foreseeable costs. And I call this exhaustive. It's not about, oh yeah, I'm going to need to do this and I'm going to need to do this, and I think it's going to cost that. It's not about having a guesstimate or a rough idea of what it is. It is having a down to the last 5 cents budget about what is going to be spent. Because this is where somebody's going to come back and say, you know what? I think you can delete this. So the grant that I am part of, and am still part of from last year, we asked for a certain amount of money, and they came back and they said, you can't spend money on this. They didn't like the fact that we wanted to bring an international expert and fly that person into the country to do work. In fact, they said you can do that online. And for us, okay, that's fine. They wanted to reduce the budget, so we just changed. In one other item, I raised it, because if it's going online, then I've got to spend more to do something else. We still flew the person in, we just changed its thing. But what I want to focus on here is you have to be very specific. They will challenge you on that. It's kind of like insurance, you know, you go to hospital and the insurance company says, well, I'll pay for your operation, but I won't pay for your anesthesia. It's kind of a pain in the ass, but it happens. You need that cost justification for each item. It's not just preparing the budget, it's explaining what that particular expense is, or its role, its relevance in the overall project. So you're justifying what you're doing. And this is like a mini essay on these items as well. And you've got to clarify if additional funding is coming from other sources, which it may well do. The dissemination. So what audience will be targeted to achieve maximum impact? Who are you sharing this research with? How are you going to reach this research, this audience? We care about what you're doing. We care about how you're spending our money. We also care about who you're distributing the research to. And because, again, that may be a conflict of interest, or it may be perfectly acceptable. And back to budget, what's the budget for dissemination? You know, are you doing printing? Are you getting a graphic designer? Are you running road shows in the community where you have to rent halls and spend money? So they're going to want to see not only what the research costs, but they're going to want to see how you get it out there and how much you're spending to make that happen as well. They're going to want to ask about timing. You've got to be very cautious with your timing. What is your task sequence? Is it logical? Is it realistic? Simple planning tools like Gantt charts, for example, being used, but also that detailed reasoning for the task sequence and the duration. Why is it taking this amount of time to do this activity? Why is this activity happening first? Now, when it comes to our research proposal for a PhD, we're not getting into perhaps this level of depth in a proposal. You know, we might fundamentally cover it in a very simplistic way, but in terms of a research grant application, chances are we're going to be more and more detailed. Now, all of that's about what you should include. Let's move quickly to writing strategies. We need to tailor the choice of language, not English, Russian, Chinese, but our tone of language, our formality, the terms, the terminologies, the words that we use, and our choice of words. We want to tailor that language and that tone to match the funder's priorities. So we're looking at their website. We're seeing what their key things are. We've got to use words, terminology that matches that, so we look like we fit well in there. Now, that can be a bit of a challenge, because I'm not talking about us doing academic style writing here, you know, conventional academic writing. I'm talking about us understanding an organization that potentially will give us money and writing specifically so we sound like that organization as well. Now, I write two styles. First, I write to communicate my ideas. Actually, I don't think about that language and tone the first time. I want to get my ideas on paper so that I understand. I start to build that story. Then I go and look at their style. I look at how they express things in their written documents. And then I edit my document to align closer to that. Now, here's the problem. If when I edit this, my application doesn't match my goals, I've had to change to fit them, and I don't like what I see, I've got to reconsider one of two things. Either I reconsider my objectives. So yeah, I still want this money. Let me think, how can I do this? How can I change my intention with my research? Or I've got to change my own ethics, because maybe I have to say, you know what, they're a little bit more open on something, or they're willing to do things that I might not be. That's a discussion I have with myself. Or actually, the third one is I might have to say, you know what, the research is interesting, the organization is interesting, but in order to get the money, I'm not achieving what I wanted to do. And therefore I might say, you know what, I'm not going to apply for this funding. And sometimes we will pull out of funding because we recognize that their expectations are different to what our goals for our own research are going to be. And at the end of the day, our ethics say, I don't want to change my research that much. I want to focus on what was important to me. So my point at the bottom here is it's not a research proposal per se. You are seeking money. It's our job as we write a funding application. It's our job to align our work to demonstrate that the funder, and I've used in brackets investor because they're investing in our research, but to demonstrate that the funder is getting a return on investment. Because even when their impact and they're looking at helping to progress knowledge, they certainly want to make sure that there is also, they're getting something back from it. It might not be financial, but they're wanting that community impact. So we've got to make sure that our proposal, our application to them, also shows that they're getting their needs met. Not only that we're the right people to do the research that we want, that it works for them as well. We need to include supporting documentation. So CVs, resumes, team bios. All I care about here is if there's 2 or more people, make sure the CV or the bios are written in the same style. You want that consistency. And the goal out of multiple people in a team is to demonstrate that you collectively have the expertise and the potential to develop with the project. You're going to want to have institutional letters of support. So this might be something from your supervisor. This may be something from your head of department or dean. That's going to be in there as well. You're going to want to have ethics approval. So if, for example, you're asking for funding to support your PhD journey, chances are you've already got university ethics approval. Put that in there because that strengthens your case. And you want to have the budgets, which we're coming up to. So the common challenges and mistakes, let's run through this before we move to budgets. The big 4 mistakes or challenges is that you don't have an you have a misalignment with funder priorities, i.e., you're not close enough to what they need. You've wasted a lot of time. And it's your time you waste, not theirs. You've wasted your time because you've said, well, I like my research. Let me try to convince them. But at the end of the day, if it's not a significant overlap with what they need, it's not going to work. If your proposal is too ambitious and it lacks feasibility, it's unlikely you can successfully complete this within the time frame or with the resources they are offering you. Then yeah, it's not going to work out. If you have poor grammar, poor formatting, insufficient detail, it's based on this assumption. If your proposal is full of mistakes, your research will be just as bad. So you really have to make sure your articulation is perfect. Because for me to give money, for me to allocate money to you to do research, I need to know that you have 100% attention to detail. And the fourth big mistake is poor time management and consideration of upcoming activities. So you don't actually plan well enough how you can execute this research and how you can disseminate this research, which includes budgeting. Maybe you under budget for dissemination, which means you've done the research, but the community doesn't get to learn about it. So that means it's not met my objectives as the funding organization. So other issues, unoriginal ideas, failure to demonstrate originality, misidentified, ill-identified, unfocused, or unsupported with preliminary data, research questions. So research questions that really aren't quite there. At the early stages of our PhD, our research questions aren't going to be perfect. They're going to take a bit of a beating along the way, and they're going to be refined. But when it comes to asking for money, it's our responsibility to have them as focused and aligned as possible. If your study, the design of your study doesn't directly answer your research questions, maybe you have a weak theoretical or conceptual underpinning that kind of shines through as, I'm really missing something, you're not going to get money. Maybe a lack of clarity over outcomes and measures. Most research, we don't know the outcomes, but we have to take a very solid, educated guess at what they'll be. We might have an incomplete or poor literature review, or we might have omitted critical references that are valid or relatable to the organization giving us money. Maybe we have staff that are unlikely to deliver, inexperienced people, which is why when we, say, for example, as we're doing our PhD and we're asking for funding to support our PhD, we have got to go back and think about every research project that we've had a contribution to. But that's also career planning. As we go into our PhD, it's not just about getting that doctor title. It's about finding those opportunities where we can gain different experience, being involved in smaller research projects by our supervisor. So many, many years ago, I was involved in a project about the globalization of the movie industry. It was fun, but truth be told, it's had no relevance to anything in terms of my own interests. But what it did is it gave me, or it enhanced my skills in archival research. It gave me a different perspective on the concept of globalization, which is where my doctorate went into. It showcased that I was able to do or handle a project on my own, given a limited budget that we had from the department. So even though it was like extra work when I was studying, what it did is it developed skills that later showcase, oh, Craig's able to do this. Craig has expertise in this, or he has experience in this. You might, another failing is lacking critical skills or expertise, or not having a development plan to acquire. We don't expect you to be perfect. What you've got to do is showcase, okay, you're missing something. How are you going to get that before the project starts? And as long as you can showcase that, I'm going to take you at your word, as will the funding organization say, you know what, they've got all these skills, they're learning that skill combined. Oh, yes, this is fine. There might be concerns over the sample, or there might be concerns over the lack of a strong dissemination plan. So all of these things are what might get us failing. So why I list them here is when you're going through and you've written your grant application, come back and look at each of those and say, have I addressed this section sufficiently to make it worthwhile? Before you submit, very easy, proofread, edit, ensure everything's complete. Make sure your co-applicants review it as well. Submit a clean version, i.e. no markups left. Make sure all your supporting documentation is there. Ask a colleague or supervisor to comment on readability and flow, probably the most important. Be aware of deadlines when asking others for input. So we're rushing this week because we have to run it through the university before we can submit it in early January to the organization that we're hoping to get funds from. And leave time to revisit and discuss budget with your host institution. This is where the budgeting is important, because you come back to your own department and you get advice from those who have been doing this for much longer. So let's move into part 2, preparing research budgets. Now, I'm going to break this into 2 as they relate to research grants, and then I'm going to do a section at the end for PhD candidates who might not have external funding and are using their own money, but how do we apply, or how do we take advantage of budgeting? So first of all, we need to read and interpret the grant guidelines. And really what we want to do is understand the expectations for this in terms of 3 key areas: people, equipment, and field work. Okay, what do they expect you're spending on people? You can't pay yourself, for example, but you can pay a research assistant. You don't apply for a grant to supplement your salary. You apply for a grant to pay for the research that you're doing. Do you have to buy, rent, or borrow equipment? Is there field work involved, and how will that get paid for? But it's also expectations. They may say field work, if you are traveling, you can only travel on economy class, or you should take a train before you take a plane. I've seen ones where accommodation must be at budget hotels under X amount of dollars per night. So, you're not getting yourself a nice holiday with first class, accommodation and flights, for example. Or you can't spend more than the going rate at the university for a research assistant. So I can't pay $100 per hour to my research assistant because the university I'm associated with sets it at $26 per hour. That's all I can pay. So there are going to be rules for you. And there are also going to be restricted or ineligible costs, things that you cannot claim. So for example, in the one that I talked about, we can't claim flights. They didn't want us to send somebody from overseas. We found a workaround. So this is the key thing. You need to be able to look at what the limits are, and you need to find a workaround. But that means you have to be very cautious with your working or your wordings to make sure that they're going to accept what your workaround is, your plan B. And that might be additional funding. It may be repackaging something. So instead of flights being part of one thing, I increased the budget elsewhere for a deliverable that I'm paying external for, and that organization paid for the flights. Now, that was fine, but it was written in a way that the outcomes aligned perfectly. And we may be looking in that case, external delivery, how we involve others, to companies or other organizations or other people to help in the delivery of the product, the research, the process. You want to have a breakdown of research. Oops, I need spelling mistake. Breakdown of research budget proposals. So 4 different things plus planning, okay? Personnel costs, salaries, stipends, consultants. Who are we paying for what? Whose time are we paying? Exactly how much it will be. There'll be operational costs, the equipment, the materials, the supplies. Are we purchasing these? Are we leasing them? If we're purchasing them, what happens to them after the project? Do they get sold? Where does the money go? Do they get donated? All of these, it's both a cost, but it's going to come back in a moment, the justification, you having to explain why. Travel and conferences. This includes field work, dissemination, networking. I added another one here. If I'm giving incentives to my respondents, for example, maybe I'm giving a $50 Starbucks card to everybody who does an interview with me. That's got to be accounted for and be very transparent about it. Travel, what is the cost at today's either exchange rate or today's market prices, but also recognizing the last one, unforeseen costs or delays. Things change, so you need to have that contingency in there, maybe a 5% buffer in case airline costs go up, in case accommodation costs go up, in case rental for room facilities to hold a town hall meeting or something, if the costs may go up, as they do. So you've got to have that buffer. You want to also identify your dissemination costs, so your publishing fees. How much is it going to cost to produce a report? That might be videography, that may be graphics, they might be printing, outreach activities. If you're going to go into the community, what's that going to cost you? It's going to cost you in terms of taxis. It's going to cost you in terms of perhaps hosting very small coffee events or any other thing. But all of this has to go into it. So they have a very strong expectation that everything's there. If, for example, you forget something and you need extra money, probably not going to get it unless you have that contingency plan, a little bit of a budget for unforeseen costs or delays. So maybe you have a 5%, maybe you have a 10% contingency plan, just in case prices change or just in case something comes up that really was unexpected. But recognizing that when we're writing an application and we're doing a budget, this is what we expect it to be. When we've finished the project, they're going to want to see that budget, and they're going to want to then align, oh, did you spend according to what you told us you would spend? And they might say, you know what, much like insurance, we're not going to cover this. You have to pay this item yourself. So you have to be cautious about that. The most important thing to do is demonstrate that you have value for money. Somebody's giving you funding, you have to justify it. So a budget justification is for each item on that, each item in your budget, why it is useful and how it contributes. A written justification for every expense. So for each item, you have to demonstrate its efficiency, you have to demonstrate its need, its priority or importance. Both of that goes in there. And that has to be aligned with the objectives and the deliverables. If I don't see how you have spent money or want to spend money on something but that doesn't directly lead to the outcome of the research project, I'm going to challenge it, or I might not allocate that money for you because I don't see its value. So you've really got to convince. So the first part of a funding application, a grant application is, look, here's my research. This is why it's good. The second part is, this is how much it's going to cost, and this is why it's needed. This is why it's essential. So you're telling a narrative here too, but in a slightly different way. Ultimately, they want value for money. I'm giving you 50,000. That money has been spent well, and I'm getting a really good outcome for it. Now, the final one before we go to Q&A is preparing research budgets as they relate to personal and self-funded research. So for those of us who are PhD candidates who are not fortunate enough to be given money from elsewhere, or maybe we're fortunate enough that we've got our own money to pay for it, how do we go about, or how do we use budgeting? To me, even if you're not given money externally, you're using your own money, you still want to have a budget for your PhD journey. It's not about tuition fees, it's about what are you spending, or what do you need to spend in order to complete the research. So again, it is the data collection costs, for example. To me, it's good practice. We want to have this in there. We also want to make sure our research doesn't cost us more than it should. Many years ago, I got a scholarship to travel overseas to do some research in Singapore. I got a huge sum of 1,500 New Zealand dollars. It was actually one of the biggest scholarships offered that year, but it didn't even cover my flights. I would have spent at least 10,000 of my own money doing that one trip on top of that scholarship. In hindsight, did my research cost me more than it should? Yeah, because I stayed a lot longer than I needed to. I'm paying for accommodation. I'm eating out at expensive places every day. Ultimately, yeah, my research probably wasn't, in research terms, worth it. Personally, sure, but in research terms, no. So it is about making sure that our research is cost effective, that we're not putting more into it than the value the research brings to the community. So we want to identify essential versus non-essential costs. And some of the typical expenses we have are data collection, so surveys, interviews, the incentives that we give people, so the Starbucks vouchers or book gift cards or whatever, access to software, subscriptions. Do I have to buy software? Yes, I have to buy certain software in order to do things. So for example, I have to buy Zoom. I can't do the free Zoom that does 40 minutes only because an average conversation with me is 1 hour 20. So already, I have to spend on that, or I have to purchase SPSS, for example. Now, here's a good thing to think about. In software in particular, there's a lot of free software out there. If you are budgeting and financial aspects are something for you to be very cautious about, use the free software. Even use cracked software. Just be transparent about what software you use. For statistical analysis, R is one of the best available free software out there. Why pay license fees? If you look at, say, NVivo, you have to pay a license fee, but there are free software that does analysis, textual analysis, or a narrative analysis. There are free software out there. You've just got to go and find that. You may have travel for field work or conferences. You may need to do professional development or skills upgrading. All of these things, it's good to put in a budget so we know what it really is costing us. So some simple strategies before I wrap up. Strategies for managing limited resources. Repurpose or reuse from previous projects. get institutional support. Get them to give you software access. If you can't get it at your library, get them to use their networks of libraries so that you can get access to things. If you can't get stuff from your library, ask a friend who's at another university. Can they help you get it? Because otherwise you're going to pay money. Use crack software. Now that's an ethical dilemma, but at the end of the day, financial cost of software to analyze data should not be the thing that stops us doing our research. And it should not be the thing that stops us creating new information, new knowledge production for society. Think about shared purchases. Maybe you need certain software that isn't subscription based. Maybe you can buy that with 2 or 3 other people. Maybe you need a video camera to record certain interactions. Maybe you can buy that with 2 or 3 other people and sell it on later. Think of that as a possibility. Always ask for student travel and student accommodation discounts. As long as you are a registered student, even though you're a PhD candidate who's kind of, the very top of the studentship equation, you're still a student. Take advantage of it. If you're looking at conferences, always ask about student hardship funds or student conference funds. So one that comes from your university first, there may be money available. Your supervisor should know, and always your supervisor has some money available, even though they say they don't. They've got some available that can be done. But a conference organizer will often do discounts from students or presenters, doesn't have to be students, presenters from developing nations. So they might have a list. They may be able to arrange cheap or free accommodation for you. They may be able to give you massive discounts on the fees for the conference. They may even be able to help you. They may have a scholarship for transportation. So there are, a lot of options out there. Explore alternative funding. So maybe your department has smaller grants, little bits of money. Look for institutional grants, just maybe a few $1,000, nothing much, but it will help you with what you've got. Fellowships, your supervisor, always harass your supervisor about what money they got, and harass your head of department too, because trust me, even when they say, oh, no, there's no money, they each have money and they can access for the right thing. So they are able to support you, but you've got to have that relationship and you've got to know how to push their buttons. One that's really worth considering that I've seen a bit more of lately is crowdfunding. So sometimes for people, PhD candidates who are trying to complete something, they may go to a crowdfunding platform, say, look, I'm seeking to find $5,000. And there will be people out there who've got a good amount of money who say, you know what, I want to help someone out. And they'll donate some money towards that. So crowdfunding is an option for funding for your PhD, for completing the research process. And finally, teaching or research positions, earn the money, but do try to get that as you go through. Okay, practical tools and resources, my last slide. There are budget templates out there for researchers. So especially as we go through, the initial creating a very detailed budget, there will be templates that you can get, you can plug your data into, you can Google for information, plug your data into. There are also free financial management tools, budgeting apps, Google Sheets, Excel, stuff that we can all access to if we don't find the templates that we want. Now,